Welcome, and thank you for joining us today to talk about advancing racial equity in Dallas. My name is Amanda Cage, and I'm the CEO of the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, we are a national network of 30 collaboratives around the country committed to innovation in the workforce development field. This includes Pathways to Work, who we will be speaking with today. I'd like to introduce Andrea Glispie, who oversees the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas portfolio of investments and career pathway programs. She also directs Pathways to Work, a cross-sector collaboration of funders, employers, and training providers working to create innovative solutions for moving entry-level workers into good middle-skilled jobs and to ensure employers have a pipeline of skilled and ready-to-work employees. We are also joined by Lindsey who has been a champion for equity for the last 14 years. She currently serves as the Equity Officer for the Office of Equity and Inclusion for the City of Dallas. As the Equity Officer, she works to shape a city government by normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing equity so that every resident in the City of Dallas has the opportunity to thrive. This work started as a national collaboration with the National Fund, PolicyLink, Burning Glass, and the USC Equity Research Institute to do a comprehensive analysis of the long-standing racial inequities in labor market outcomes. We did a national report and then dug deep into 5 communities, including Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, Chicago, and Dallas. Nationally, there were some key findings. Number 1, growing diversity and changing demographics underscore the urgent need for racial economic inclusion. 2, racial inequity is a drag on economic growth. 3, COVID-19 is exacerbating pre-existing conditions. 4, higher educational attainment is insufficient to eliminate workforce inequities. And finally, automation, which was accelerated in the wake of the pandemic, disproportionately places people of color and immigrants at risk of being dislocated from their jobs. So let's dig into the Dallas report. I'm going to start with Andrea. Can you tell me what the Advancing Workforce Equity in Dallas and Collin Counties, a Blueprint for Action report revealed about the challenges the Dallas workforce faces?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. And it's great to be here today to have this conversation. There were a lot of findings that, either surprised us or intrigued us, but definitely, hopefully at the end of the day, really kind of mobilize, all sectors in our Dallas community around greater workforce equity. I'll talk through some of the main findings which are consistent with the national report. First and foremost, people of color make up the majority of our region's workforce, but they're not sharing equitably in our economic prosperity. Dallas has been known as an economic powerhouse. It's one of the engines that powered the Texas Miracle that many folks may be familiar with that term. Texas was fortunate to be creating jobs and expanding its economy, especially during the years of the Great Recession, where a lot of parts of the country were reeling from the economic downturn. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Workers of color make up about 60% of the workforce between the ages of 25 and 64. So, people have talked about the ensuing demographic trends that we'll foresee, where people of color will be making the majority of the workforce, but that's already happening here in Dallas and Collin County. It's also worth noting that 3/4 of young workers under the age of 25 are people of color. But Black and Latinx workers are about twice as likely as their white counterparts to be economically insecure. So again, that's a lot of cause for concern. Another thing that the report pointed out, which definitely rang a lot of bells for us, is that there are economic implications for the inequities we see for the workforce. In fact, the report found out that in 2018 alone, racial gaps in wages and employment for working age people cost the region about 115 billion in lost GDP. So there's some real economic consequences for not having greater racial inequity. The report also showed that if we were able to increase racial equity or workforce equity, we could double the average annual income of Black workers from about $37,000 to $74,000, and the region's GDP would increase by 35%. Another thing to note in the report is that our workforce is deeply segregated. Despite our growing diversity, there seems to be a swath of workers of color being crowded in low-paying jobs and lower occupational groups, while white workers are overrepresented in many higher paying professions. And we call this occupational segregation. So that was particularly clear and stark in the report. As we look at good jobs in our economy, the region overall has a shortfall of good jobs that don't require a college degree. Only about 40% of workers are in good jobs. When we disaggregate that data by workers' race and ethnicity, the picture looks a little bleaker. The share drops to just 12% among workers of color in good jobs that don't require more than a high school diploma. And the good jobs gap, it has some significant racial implications, considering that 36% of Black workers, 47% of US-born Latinx workers, and 81% of Latinx immigrants have no college education. So many of them are losing out on being in good jobs. One of the things that was really eye-opening in our report was that, education isn't the great equalizer that we think it is. In fact, we see racial disparities in education at every level, from no high school through associate or through advanced degrees. So for instance, a white worker with only a high school education earns the same median wages as a Black or Latinx worker with an associate degree. We also looked at what we call the social determinants of work. And basically, those are those social supports that make it possible for people to enter and stay and hopefully advance in the labor market. And what we found is that those social determinants of work are pretty frayed for Black and Latinx workers. In fact, Black and Latinx workers are more likely than any other group to experience housing cost burden, childcare cost burden, and transportation challenges. We're also, as a community, spending a lot of time really kind of working through the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our economy. Dallas has bounced back a little bit quicker than some of the other urban areas around the country, but still the jobs that are coming back right now are those that require very little formal preparation. So the jobs that require, more than a high school education are not coming back as quickly. Finally, the report, and this was eye-opening for us to take in, is that as we look at the future of work and the impact of automation, what we find is that Black and Latinx workers will be disproportionately affected by automation. In fact, there are we looked at least 33 occupations with at least 5,000 workers of color or more, and all of these jobs face above average risk of automation. So those were just some of the key findings that we are lifting out in our report and having community conversations about.
Wow, that's a lot of really rich data and paints a very complex picture of what's going on in the labor market in Dallas. Dr. Wilson, I want to ask you, Two questions. One is, how did you get involved in the equity working group for Dallas? Part of the configuration of this work was not just digging into the data, but bringing together stakeholders and connectors and influencers to talk about what some of those solutions could be. And then really specifically for you in the role that you play in your regular job in Dallas, what are you trying to accomplish around racial equity?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me join the conversation first. To answer your question, they're kind of one in two folds. So Andrea actually extended an invitation. I was at the time an equity manager for the Office of Equity. And so really, as you mentioned, the Office of Equity and Inclusion seeks to shape a city government where everyone can thrive. And what we know to be true, not just here in Dallas, but across the country, is race dictates outcomes. And so within our office, while we're a majority internal facing department, we do external endeavors. And the external endeavors and efforts that we do really seek to close disparities and dig deeper into the root causes of the inequities that we face here in Dallas. So this was a prime opportunity. I am honored to have been a part of the process as we dove deeper into the data and the solutions.
Great. So, Andrea, one of the things that you all raised up in the report was apprenticeships as a model for achieving equity. Apprenticeships are complicated and require a lot of coordination. Can you tell me a little bit about what your plan is in terms of really promoting apprenticeships as a means to reducing racial inequities?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the great question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Apprenticeships require very deep partnerships. It often takes employers, education organizations, nonprofits, and other types of workforce intermediaries working together very closely to make these work-based learning opportunities possible. We know from apprenticeships that employers are key to providing the work experience. Education organizations are critical to ensuring that work experience is supplemented with good training. And nonprofits are key to ensure that participants have wraparound services and supports so they can persist and complete apprenticeship programs. If done right, apprenticeships offer an extraordinary opportunity for workers, particularly workers of color. However, we do know that workers of color traditionally are underrepresented in apprenticeships, in part because of the inequities in the recruitment process. And sometimes not as robust social networks of workers of color that are needed to know where these opportunities exist. So this is really why, we really honed in on this recommendation for a couple of reasons. One is that, as I mentioned, the occupational segregation in our labor market is stark. And we see that a lot of workers of color, particularly Black and Latinx workers, are crowded in low-paying jobs. So we see the apprenticeships being a key pathway where workers of color can get good work experience, training, build up their social, social capital networks, and hopefully get a leg up in some of these growing occupations that provide good paying jobs. It's not the only answer. I mean, obviously the report lifted up some major things around pay inequities in particular, but we think it's part of an overall workforce equity strategy. I will say that Dallas is home to a lot of really burgeoning apprenticeship opportunities that are just now getting off the ground. And so, one of the key recommendations that we saw for Dallas is that we wanted to make sure that communities of color are better connected with these opportunities. And that may mean forming some unlikely partnerships between local leaders and community organizing organizations that have the trust and the relationships with especially Black and Latinx workers to ensure that there is a robust recruitment pipeline to these opportunities. I will say that especially Dallas College, through its apprenticeship programs, have set recruitment goals for getting getting students of color enrolled in apprenticeships. And so we really see one of the central recommendations around, helping the college meet that goal. And really digging into our community and understanding, who are the local leaders that we may not know of or have seen at meeting after meeting on various education and workforce issues. And what are the community organizers that that don't tend to necessarily have workforce development on their priority list of issues that they're working on, but could, if we're able to identify who those organizations are and begin to build relationships with them. So that is what we definitely see as one of our key strategies moving forward.
So the tagline for these reports is blueprint in action, with a little focus on the word action. So I want to, this is really the reports were really the beginning, right? The beginning of the work, and we're all really solution oriented here. For both of you, what happens next?
Yeah, go ahead, Lindsey.
You're both so polite. I'll let Lindsey go first. There you go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. A couple of things. One of the things that I do want to amplify is the Equity Indicators report that the City of Dallas released 2 years ago, which really looked at economic opportunity, and what we see within this report aligns with what we've seen in that report. The Equity Indicators report really zoned in on 5 themes: education, neighborhoods and infrastructures, economic opportunity, justice and government, and public health. And so, as Andrea mentioned around education no longer being seen as a great equalizer, and the ways in which, despite workers' education, communities of color are still being paid at a lower rate. Some of the intersections between what this report says aligns with what the Equity Indicators report says. And so when we're talking about action steps and what we're doing, the City of Dallas has a workforce education and equity committee, and that's chaired by Councilmember Casey Thomas. And that really zones in specifically looking at the workforce development strategy and implementation of the city's resilience plan to make Dallas a more equitable city. Again, looking at the intersectionality between the two. At the City of Dallas, last budget cycle, we increased full-time city employees' wages to $14, and we're expecting to do another increase coming up. Our office recently held a inclusive and equitable bounce back. So pulling in private, public, and nonprofit sectors to talk about some of the inequities that we see within the workforce and what we need to do to tackle these inequities as we're thinking about next steps and moving forward. So those are just a couple of things that we're currently engaged in. Andrea, I'll pass it back to you to highlight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lindsey. You're right. Amanda, this really, the title of the report says it all, a blueprint for action. And, even though we've spent the better part of over a year on putting the report together, our work doesn't end just because the report's been released. Because at the end of the day, we don't want this to just be another publication that gets a lot of fanfare and then sits on people's shelves. Or right now, no one is in a work office, I don't think. So it's probably in a file. We don't want them to be files on a file in a document in one of your files on your laptop is probably the better way of looking at it. We want this to be a living, breathing document that guides all of our work and shapes our thinking about what we need to do to advance workforce equity. So I think that, at least for the first couple of months, now that the report is out there, is that, Pathways to Work in collaboration with our cross-sector advisory group wants to be able to hold, a series of organizational listening sessions that are more interactive in nature. Instead of just doing a basic data presentation, we want to have a conversation with key groups about, some of the historical forces that, shape the data and what we see here today. But then also allows people to look at our strategies and really hopefully figure out how it aligns with their work. Because ultimately we want people to see, see themselves and their efforts in the recommendations, and then take that next step and think about, how can I better align my work to address these recommendations, or how can I go deeper? So that's really going to be a key part of our work going forward. Our recommendations, there are 8 recommendations overall. They cover a lot of different issues, apprenticeships being one of them. But we also look at things like skills-based hiring, retention and advancement strategies that hopefully get, workers of color not only in good paying career advancing jobs, but keep them and help them be successful as they work their way through the labor market. We have recommendations on disaggregating data, so we have a better sense of how workers of color are faring in educational programs. Are they exiting with credentials? Are they securing jobs and retaining those jobs in the labor market? We also have recommendations around job quality. I mentioned earlier just the deficit in good jobs, in our local labor market. And so we have a recommendation on how we can create more quality jobs. And then some of our other recommendations are focused on the digital divide and increasing digital literacy skills. We know that so many more jobs now than ever have become digitized, and that trend is going to keep growing. It's not going away. But we also know that we need to double down on our investments in adult literacy, so that those workers that need the basic skills in order to take advantage of other apprenticeship or educational opportunities can do so. 2 of our other recommendations are kind of new to us. They're not necessarily typically what workforce-oriented initiative would take on, but we really saw, worker power and worker voice being a key component to the conversation. And we wanted to make sure, we've known that other cities like Chicago are building pretty robust bridges between worker power and worker organizing organizations and workforce development organizations. Here locally in Dallas, there is those two bodies of work are kind of siloed. And so we want to build bridges or connections between organizations that are doing workforce development or training with those organizations that are focused on building power and organizing workers, so that participants in training programs, they know their rights, they can advocate for themselves, and ultimately it helps them be successful, hopefully, as they enter and advance in the labor market. We also have a recommendation around housing, because I mentioned earlier that Black and Latinx workers are increasingly more cost cost burdened when it comes to housing. More of their income is spent on housing than any other racial or ethnic group. And so we realized that that's something we also needed to step into, particularly again, as it relates to better alignment of workforce development programs to housing initiatives. We think that there is some promising work that's happening locally that we can build on, and we can build on and expand. So these are the types of recommendations that, we want to talk in our listening sessions and get people thinking about how their work aligns with these recommendations. So hopefully we can collaboratively advance them. We've already, actually just had an advisory group meeting this morning, within Pathways to Work. And we spent a lot of time actually prioritizing what we wanted to work on first. I mentioned that there are 8 recommendations, and the reality is that we can't work on them all at the same time. So we spent some time in small and large groups kind of looking at, given these 8 we have in front of them, what can we prioritize, and what can funders prioritize. And I will tell you that one of the big learnings that came out of that conversation is our skills-based hiring, retention, and advancement recommendation got a lot of interest of our advisory group for moving forward. We also, if you look at our report, the recommendations, and this just kind of rounds out my long response to your short question, but our recommendations are divided. We've looked at each recommendation in the report in terms of what employers, community-based organizations, and funders can do. So we also asked the advisory group what we think that funders should do, because Pathways to Work also convenes regular meetings with local funders that have an interest in or have workforce development in their portfolio. And so, the feedback that the advisory group gave us is what we're going to take back to that funders group to kind of hopefully inspire them to begin to align their investments and act. So that's just some of the work that, has gone into what our recommendations look like and how we hope to carry them forward.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both so much for your work and your leadership on the ground. Andy, as you said, we didn't write these reports to sit on a shelf or sit on a desktop, virtual or non-virtual, but to be a catalyst for action. And so I want to point out where the reports are available. If you're interested in learning more or reading through the report, they're available online at nationalfund.org. Just press the publications button. In terms of next steps, Pathways to Work will be hosting a meeting on March 23rd as a community conversation about the report. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, feel free to reach out. To learn more about Pathways to Work, go to pathwaystowork.org. And thank you, everybody, for